Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Strategic Directions for a Digital Consciousness Model. In this talk, we're going to delve into a fascinating ongoing project at Rethink Priorities, which is trying to create a framework for estimating the probability of consciousness in artificial systems. And we're lucky enough to have not one, but two speakers from Rethink joining us here. Hayley Clatterbuck and Derek Shiller are both senior researchers on the Worldview Investigations team at Rethink. And Hayley's also a visiting associate professor of philosophy at UCLA. Before I get out of the way, quick reminder, you can go ahead now and open up Swap Card on your device, click on this session, and then click on the Live Interactions tab. And there'll be a chat there where you can ask your own questions as the talk comes up so you don't forget, and also up or down vote questions that are already there so that I can make sure to ask the ones that are most pressing when we get to the Q&A. There'll also be office hours if you really want to get some more questions and one-on-one time with the speakers in Junior Ballroom 4. That's right upstairs after the session. All right, please join me in welcoming Derek and Hayley.
Hi, everybody. Very excited to be here and to see so many people interested in this project. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what we've been thinking about, why we are engaging in this project, and the key kind of decision points that we are facing and trying to address. And then I'm going to hand it over to Hayley, who will talk about more of the nuts and bolts of the approach that we've been developing. This is an ongoing project, so I'm not going to be able to share any results from it. But I would like to get your thoughts and opinions about some of the choices that we've made, because we can still incorporate feedback in how we choose to proceed. So let me just start off by giving you a very broad picture of what we are hoping to do. So we want to have a model that has certain primary inputs, has a lot of parameters too that you can tweak, but the primary inputs are going to be views about the relative plausibilities of major theories of consciousness. These are theories of consciousness that are drawn from literature in philosophy or in cognitive science, informed by expert opinion about consciousness in humans and other animals, but applied to artificial systems. That's one of the main ingredients. Another ingredient is measurements taken from actual AI systems, things like GPT-4. So we want to take those measurements. These are supposed to be objective, verifiable, concrete things you might see in the system or look for in a system, and figure out how those measurements relate to the various major perspectives on consciousness, and use that to create a model which will actually output probabilities of consciousness in different systems. So that's the big picture. But I'm going to take a step back and talk you through why you might want to do something like this, and why we are engaged in this project. So I'm going to break this up into a couple different decision points. So one thing is, why are we concerned about digital consciousness? And we can think about that as, why are we concerned with digital minds in general? And why are we concerned with consciousness specifically? So digital minds, I'm going to use that in a fairly non-technical, vague way. Digital minds are things that look like candidates for moral status. I expect that we will see AI systems in the coming years that are agentic, that are person-like in having maybe a personality, in having memory, in learning and interacting with their environments. And when we have systems like that, we will be inclined to view them with the categories that we view humans and other animals. We'll be inclined to think that maybe they deserve rights and protections. And I think it's pretty likely that we will see something like that, but there will be a big question: are they legitimate moral subjects? Are they things we should legitimately care about, we should give ethical protections to? And that, we expect, will be controversial. So we think digital minds are coming. we think they might be important in the moral sense. We think that maybe we will owe them moral consideration. Maybe they will suffer. Maybe we can take steps now that will help give them better lives. And in the far future, the longer you look out, you might think there's going to be more and more of them. And it might be really important. Maybe the majority of welfare in the future, if you look far enough out, will belong to digital minds. So they might be really important. But even if you don't think they will be really important, you should think that many people will think that they are morally important. And we'll have to decide whether or not we want to make sacrifices on their behalf, how we will allocate resources, how we will manage safety concerns. And a lot of these things will depend on what we think we really owe to them. So it's important that we get this right, whether or not we get it right by overestimating or underestimating the probability of their consciousness. Finally, we at Rethink Priorities want to be involved in thinking about digital minds, in part because there are groups of people who have been thinking about digital minds in various ways for quite a long time, largely in the academic world. But academia has incentives and processes and norms that we think are not ideal for dealing with the challenges that are coming up. One of the main challenges is that academia moves very slowly. It takes a while for academics to reflect upon what's going on in the changing technological landscape, come up with ideas that are relevant to that landscape, and disseminate those ideas. It can take years. Whereas you can move from having an idea of a new kind of AI model to building that model to distributing it to millions of people in a year or less. So we think that it's important to be able to move quickly and to engage in kind of non-traditional ways with this changing landscape. But why consciousness? So if you're very familiar with the literature that's emerged on digital minds, if you've read a lot of the philosophy, you'll know that there is a lot of skepticism about whether consciousness is necessary for moral status or whether it's sufficient. Could we have AI systems that had no phenomenal experiences but still mattered as moral subjects? Perhaps. Could we have AI systems that were conscious but didn't suffer, and on that account weren't moral subjects either? Possibly. We aren't trying to reject that idea when we're building a model that's focused specifically on consciousness and not on moral status or other markers of moral status. But we think consciousness is a good place to start. It's worthy of the first kind of serious attention to this topic. It's worthy of being our focus for the time being. So one reason for that is that consciousness is important to many moral theories. It's debatable. Philosophers disagree about whether consciousness is necessary, but many, many people think it is necessary, or think at least it's an important component of moral status. And so it's one of the less controversial attributes that we might look for in deciding whether an AI system is a moral subject. It's also true that this is a fairly esoteric debate. So philosophers debate this, but I think most people, the general public, the people who will be having to make decisions about policy around digital minds, are ready to think that they matter if they are conscious, and they don't matter if they're not conscious. So if we're trying to influence those people, we want to build a model that will tell them something they care about, and consciousness is a good place to start for that. Finally, consciousness is just a rich subject. So in building a model of digital consciousness, we will have to think about a lot of things that other moral theories matter. We'll have to think about what agency really requires. We'll have to think about what kinds of desires AI systems might have. And so I think starting with an approach on consciousness will provide a lot of insight into other things that even if you're not entirely sure about consciousness, you should think are important. So that's why we should care about digital consciousness, but why build a model of it? So let me first just point out different ways that academics have addressed the question of whether we should think AI systems today or in the near future might be conscious. So one approach is to develop your own theory of consciousness or take a theory that you buy already and look for what things it says are requirements, what things a system must have according to that theory to be conscious. And then look at your AI system and see, does my AI system have this thing? If it lacks this thing, then you can infer that it's not conscious. So there are a number of people who have developed theories of consciousness, who have applied those theories, and who say AI systems can't be conscious. One downside to this approach is that there's just too many ways that this can go. And you can see there are a lot of different theories of consciousness out there, and they're also fairly different from each other. So simply having a piecemeal approach where you say, maybe this theory, no, that requires that, and AI systems lack that, so they're not conscious according to that theory, still leaves a lot of uncertainty. You're uncertain unless you can confirm that the true theory is among the theories that have been explored, and unless you're confident in the AI systems lacking the relevant characteristics. Another approach is you might identify specific tests that, if applied to an AI system, would count as confirming consciousness. So an example of this test is proposed by Susan Schneider, who has suggested that we could maybe train an AI, giving it no exposure to any text about consciousness. Maybe train an LLM, but exclude any talk of consciousness from its training set. And then see, will it start talking about consciousness? Will it claim to have experiences without having been prompted with that possibility beforehand? These tests might tell you something very interesting. I think there are no good tests that will be both cheap to apply, that is feasible, really, with frontier models, and that we can take the results from and think that they're very strong evidence either way. So single tests don't seem like the ideal approach. We want to look at what evidence actually exists and try to make a decision on the basis of that evidence. Another approach is when apply theories of consciousness, that is, take the span of theories that there are, see what each theory tries to say, and draw a conclusion. This is kind of like identifying missing requirements, but is more open as to what evidence you actually consider. So we're going to take each theory by itself, see what it says, apply it, and try to produce a verdict. One problem with this is that we have to be confident that we know the right theories and the right interpretations of them. So a challenge for this kind of project is that existing theories of consciousness have been formulated with respect to humans and animals. And there's a lot of assumptions that you can leave unspecified if you're focused on humans and animals, because humans and animals share a lot in common. If you only want to distinguish conscious from unconscious states in humans and animals, you don't have to worry about things like whether the material substrate makes a difference, or exactly what kinds of fundamental information processing structures you need, whether they can be, whether they have to be parallel or you can have them sequential, that sort of thing. So we think that this would be a very laborious process to actually identify every plausible interpretation of every theory you might have. And we would like something that's easier to apply, that's more modular, and that requires a lot less really focused attention to every individual theory. Finally, you might try to think of all of the different forms of necessary and sufficient conditions you have for consciousness, or people have proposed for consciousness, assign them probabilities, and just do some sort of algebra. See what necessary conditions AI systems might have, what sufficient conditions they lack, and compute a probability on the basis of those. This would leave out a lot of sources of evidence that we think are important. Because if you actually look at what theories of consciousness say, they tend not to incorporate a lot of the things that people actually seem to respond to when attributing consciousness. So we think intelligence matters. We think that complexity matters. These are things like people did not wonder whether computers were conscious 10 years ago or 20 years ago the way that we do now. And the chief difference is intelligence. But if you look at the major theories of consciousness, they don't say anything about intelligence, or at least nothing direct. It's all much more vague. So we want to be able to incorporate kinds of evidence that people think are important, but aren't explicitly in the formulation of the theories that have been developed. Why build a probabilistic model? So we think probabilities matter. We care about the numbers we get out. And we don't just care about that because we think that the numbers that we get out of our model are going to be reliable, or that they're going to give you what you should actually think about the probability of consciousness in a artificial system. We think probabilities matter for a couple reasons. They are important for deciding whether to implement a costly policy, because you can, with probabilities, do expected value calculations. But probabilities also just make the disagreements more concrete in a way. If we don't have any kind of probabilistic model, then you can picture what policymakers are going to hear in the future when they're confronted by questions of artificial sentience, digital consciousness. They're going to hear that there are some experts who think something, other experts who think the opposite, and there's no agreement among those experts as to what's actually the case. That might make it look like we can't trust these experts. We have to make up our mind ourselves, and they can offer little guidance. But if we can incorporate the disagreements into a consensus model, then we have something concrete that you have to reject or object to if you're going to go with a radically different answer. We can say, we've distilled expert opinion into this number. If you think this number is wrong, please point out where you disagree. And maybe that will be possible and that will be fruitful. But it will also, I think, make it easier to show that experts have something to contribute. The process of getting to a specific number is also important and valuable. In order to get to a specific number, you have to work out the details of how everything you think matters. And the process of just putting all of those into a single model will test your assumptions. It will force you to think about all the different components and how they relate to each other. And in our experience, and on the Worldview Investigations team at Rethink Priorities, we've built a number of models. In our experience, that's just a valuable learning opportunity. Models can also clarify disagreements. So insofar as we don't all come to the same conclusion, a model can give you a formal framework for thinking about where your disagreements arise. And we expect there to be a lot of disagreement. And we look forward to seeing how people locate the disagreements in the parameter settings of our model. So with that, I will turn it over to Hayley to talk about the specifics.
Great. Thank you, Derek. So Derek laid out some very serious, very considerable challenges that have faced previous efforts to come up with a judgment of the probability of consciousness for AI systems. So how do we intend to tackle these challenges? What do we have to say about how we're going to improve upon some of the efforts we have already? As Derek mentioned, a lot of the very specific statistical methodologies that we're pursuing are still under development. But I can lay out some of the general modeling choices we've made so far as an attempt to solve some of these problems. So a first and maybe obvious problem when you're trying to think about consciousness in a precise way is that we have significant uncertainty about which theory of consciousness is true, if it indeed is any that we've come up with so far. So over the past few decades, we've seen real progress and a proliferation of theories about what makes individuals conscious. But I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been any consensus reached, and indeed there hasn't been as much convergence as we would like. So how do we build a model when no one's quite sure what makes things conscious and what makes them unconscious? So in the model, we're dealing with this by including a range of what we call stances, which are sort of perspectives on what is relevant to consciousness. This will include theories that have been really well developed and worked out in cognitive science and philosophy, theories like global workspace theory or attention schema theory. Some of these make very specific posits about what kinds of architectures or what kinds of features need to be present in order for something to be conscious. We'll definitely include those. But we'll also include less formal, less sort of scientifically developed stances towards consciousness. For example, like bio-chauvinism. This is a perspective that says biology is essential somehow to consciousness, even if it's not making any sort of specific claims about what biologically is necessary or sufficient. So we want to include, again, these sort of scientific theories and more general perspectives that people have towards consciousness. Our model, as we will see, I'll show you a picture in a bit, will take each of these different stances and sort of generate a probability of consciousness by the lights of that stance. And then we can aggregate over these stances, sort of combining what they say to get to an all things considered judgment about the probability of consciousness. Secondly, as Derek mentioned, we have some very interesting, compelling theories of consciousness. But it takes a lot of work to say what these theories say about the probability of consciousness in AI systems in particular. So many of our best theories of consciousness were developed to describe consciousness in humans or other creatures that are very similar to us. And there's a real question to say, well, how would that apply? How would, say, a certain marker of consciousness apply in a being with a very different cognitive architecture, a very different physical constitution, a very different form of life? People have started doing this work, and I think there's a lot of really good work out here, but it just goes to show you that it's hard to translate these theories to the AI context. So how are we going to deal with this uncertainty? So we introduce a level of our model that picks out features. Features are sort of general properties that people think, or that many theories think, are relevant to consciousness. These are things like attention, or recurrent processing, or modality integration, things like that. So by trying to identify common themes among consciousness researchers, we want to sort of like unite what some of these very specific theories have to say. So we're sacrificing a little bit of the precision of a specific theory to say something more general about the kinds of features that we think will be relevant to consciousness. Lastly, as we all know, AI systems and our evidence about them are changing rapidly. So if you think you know what AIs are like and what they're capable of, wait 2 weeks and you'll be wrong. So we need to have a framework that allows us to flexibly introduce new kinds of evidence as AI systems develop. And we need a way of incorporating patchy evidence. Unfortunately, it might be the case that we're not always going to know what these systems are like. And we need something that allows us to make some judgments even when we have incomplete evidence sets. So we do this by introducing sort of the bottommost layer of our model, which is a flexible list of indicators. These are observable, verifiable properties that AI systems could have that are evidentially relevant to their possession of those consciousness-relevant features. These might be things like the ability to formulate multi-step plans or recognize their own outputs versus the outputs of similar models using similar prompts, or even to do well on the SAT or win at strategy games or something like that. And we're going to do a Bayesian treatment of evidence here, that the indicators are going to be taken to be probabilistically relevant to certain features rather than necessary or sufficient in most cases. And we are going to update on these, our probability that they have certain features based on their possession of various indicators. And again, we think this methodology is going to allow a lot of flexibility for the integration of new kinds of evidence, tracking how our probabilities change over time, and deal with cases where we have a serious absence of evidence. So before I show you what the model will look like, here are sort of 3 major design choices that we've made so far and that our further development of the model will be consistent with. The first is that we have a hierarchical model structure, going from indicators to features to stances to our all things considered probability of consciousness. We introduce that middle layer of thematic features. Instead of just going straight from theories of consciousness to probabilities, we're adding this layer of features that can add some generality and some unification. And we're going to use a Bayesian treatment of evidence that allows us to adjust our probabilities over time, as opposed to the sort of logical algebra of necessary and sufficient conditions. Here's just a sort of diagram of what one piece of a model might look like. So at the bottom, we have various indicators. Again, these are observable properties that a AI system could have. And those are evidentially relevant to the possession of certain features. Okay? So those indicators raise or lower our probability that an AI system has a certain feature, or it tells us that it has a certain feature to a certain extent, right? How strongly it possesses something like attention or recurrent processing or complexity or whatever. And then different stances at the blue level there say different things about which features are important. Okay, so a theory of consciousness is going to say, these are the features that we think are relevant from the perspective of our theory. And so given the level of those features that a system has, here's how likely it is that a machine is conscious. Okay, so we think of stances as like functions from features to probabilities of consciousness. And you can define all different sorts of stances from your feature list. And then finally, when we have a judgment about what each stance says about the probability of consciousness, you can aggregate that in some way to get to your all things considered judgment. You also might decline to do that if you just really care about one stance. But you could instead say, look, here's the probabilities that the community assigns to different stances. What is sort of our considered judgment about the probability of consciousness by doing a weighted average over those stances. So let's focus on one of these sort of vertical chains to give an example of what kinds of things might be inputs to this model and what kinds of parameter choices you'd have to make. So here's an example of a stance you might have. We just picked one. Higher order thought theory is one of the more prominent theories of consciousness from at least 20 years ago in the philosophy literature. And it says the following. A first-order mental state, like perceiving green, becomes conscious when it becomes the target of a higher-order thought that represents that lower-order state. So my perception of greenness becomes conscious when I have a higher-order thought that says, I am having that experience of greenness, right? It represents the lower-order states. So suppose you had this theory. Multiple features are going to be relevant to consciousness according to this theory. Any conscious system is going to have representation. It's going to have meta representations. It's going to have attention, flexible attention. And plausibly, it also requires a self-other distinction to represent I'm having this first-order mental state, not just this first-order mental state is being had. Okay. So you say all of these things contribute to the extent that something has these features, it makes it more probable to be conscious relative to this stance. So how do we test for a self-other distinction? Well, we can start proposing indicators by looking at the literature on the study of animal minds, human minds, talk to computer scientists. Here are a few plausible indicators you might take to be relevant to that feature. One, as I mentioned earlier, you might ask whether or not an LLM can recognize its own output. Can it tell that it was something that it said as opposed to something that was said by another interlocutor or another LLM responding to a similar prompt? We can also, and people have started doing this, applying tests from the developmental psychology and comparative psychology literatures to AIs. So putting them through batteries of false belief tasks or mirror self-recognition tests. So once we have this model that specifies all these indicators we want to look for, then we can go look for them. And we can start updating our probabilities on that basis. So here's kind of an illustration of the Bayesian approach at work. And this is just a kind of toy Bayesian model, not to take too seriously. So a Bayesian model takes a prior as an input, as we all know. And so in particular, it'll start with a prior probability towards the top of our hierarchy. That relative to a stance, what's the probability that a given AI, the prior probability that an AI is conscious? Okay. And then we observe the things at the bottom of the hierarchy, and those probabilities flow upward through the model. So in this case, suppose you had your prior probability is mass is represented by the gray spike there. It's about 10%, suppose. In the top left corner, you're conditioning on the fact that neither one of these indicators was present. Okay. Predictably, that's going to reduce your probability that the machine is conscious. And notice that there's still going to be some uncertainty, right? There's some spread. We're not quite sure if the features are relevant. We're not quite sure if these indicators, suggest the presence of these features. There's still going to be some uncertainty, but your probability mass has moved to thinking it's less likely to be conscious. In the bottom right, on the other hand, you've observed that both of these indicators were present, and you've now updated your posterior probability to now thinking that it's maybe 30% probable that this machine is conscious. But notice there's significant spread in your uncertainty as well. We like Bayesian approaches. We like hierarchical Bayesian approaches for a few reasons. One is that it allows you to track uncertainty. And with a model that is going to include as many uncertainties as a probability of consciousness model, we think that's important. Second, we like that we use likelihood functions as opposed to sort of necessary and sufficient conditions to represent the evidential relationships, the evidential importance of certain indicators. And we like that it's flexible. It can deal with absence of evidence, and it can update in this cumulative way. We can add new evidence without scrapping the model. Okay, so I want to conclude by saying, what are our hopes for this kind of model? What are our goals in proposing it? So success of a model like this is going to depend on, well, more than two, but at least these two conditions. if we want to have a comprehensive model of the probability of machine consciousness, it's going to include lots of different stances that require lots of different kinds of expertise. It's going to include a lot of different expertise about how to test for certain features. A lot of expertise is going to be necessary. So we want to draw on a broad base of expertise and judgments that would be necessary to represent this body of knowledge. Secondly, we need availability of data about system indicators. What are these systems actually like? Can we actually test sort of new systems and have any insight into what they're doing and what they're capable of? So we don't want our model just to reflect sort of the considered judgments of the people on the Worldview Investigations team. Instead, what we want to do is propose this model as a guiding framework for organizing research and facilitating cumulative progress in this area. Some really good work is being done, and more people are getting into this field and interested in contributing. And sometimes to make cumulative progress, you need a paradigm. You need a way of organizing the work to see the work people have already done and what's left to do. So we hope that our model can provide that kind of framework that will allow people to pick projects and we can make progress on it together. Secondly, we think that the digital consciousness model can potentially highlight indicators and features that are going to be really important in moving our probability judgments. We can, when we have the model, say, hey, it turns out that like this one feature is looking like it's going to make a really big difference. That helps us zero in on the kinds of information that's going to be most valuable for us to know, both for us to investigate and potentially to get leverage or to press the people who do know these systems the best to provide that information. So we're looking forward to further elaborating this model. We're looking forward to sort of trying to provide a roadmap for research, future research ourselves and potentially others. And we look forward to hearing your feedback on it. Thanks.
All right. Hayley, Derek, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. And thank you to those of you who have already submitted questions on Swapcard. Remind that you can do that throughout the Q&A. We have about 15 minutes here to get some feedback from this ongoing project. So I guess I'm curious to start. You mentioned, as you showed us that slide of posterior and prior probabilities, that you're expecting a lot of uncertainty given the nature of this topic. We have a question from Cameron Berg of the audience, which is basically just that at the very sort of highest level of choosing what theories and stances to even incorporate, it seems like you're going to have to omit some, include others, and that's going to weigh significantly on what the ultimate output is. So yeah, how are you planning on dealing with that sort of very fundamental source of uncertainty and making sure that you're not double counting theories that have slightly different variations, those kind of questions?
I can say something about that. A nice feature of the addition of that intermediate layer of features is that it allows us to define stances as a function of those features and to make sure that there's not overlap, right? So every stance, a stance that posits unique values of the features or like ways that those like features are related to consciousness, like a unique function from features to probabilities, will count as a distinct theory, right? That are like strictly not identical to one another. So it's a way of basically ensuring that we can get mutually exclusive hypotheses, which will be important for a Bayesian model. And it's also an important way of like constructing new stances out of those features.
Yeah, to add to that too, I think the fuzziness of our features helps with that. So we're not defining stances as like precise conditions. If you wanted to have a precise set of conditions, you need to really think about all of the different combinations that could matter. But if you interpret stances as just putting more emphasis on different kinds of features, like this stance emphasizes the similarity to the human brain. This stance emphasizes the importance of intelligence and creativity, etc. Then you can kind of do more. You're not going to get precisely what a particular view of consciousness says, but you kind of represent a ballpark of views and at the same time. And so I think it still will be challenging to represent the full variety of views that we think you should take seriously. But there's less of a danger of trying to count each exact one of them. And I think we can kind of cast a wider net with our approach.
That's actually a very elegant solution. Okay, so we know that the way you're arriving at these posteriors is through this sort of Bayesian updating rule. But what about setting the priors in the first place? How are you going about getting that mathematical starting point?
So I think there are a few things to be said here. And one sort of way to express some skepticism about the project is going to be like, so you're just going to get your priors out, right? And so I want to like combat that in a few ways. So one is you can try to give as uninformative as a prior as possible, just to say like any combination of features is equally likely as any others to be relevant. Another thing you can do is poll the community and experts and try to say like, hey, what proportion of people actually buy into various kinds of stances? Can we represent, if what we want the model to put out is what is our all things considered judgment as a community of the probabilities, and you want to put priors in that reflect that those community views. Those are a couple ways of trying to solve the problem.
I think it's also not entirely bad if you just get out what you put in, because there is extra structure. The model is doing something. And you can't necessarily predict how all of the priors that you put in are going to translate into different theories of consciousness. So at least the act of having to specify those priors and see what you get out is informative. And then the hope is also that if you have enough priors in there, that your priors will make less of a big difference and that you'll ultimately get a better reflection of the balance of evidence as it actually is.
Nice. Okay, one or two more questions on the sort of specifics of the modeling, and then I think people are keen to talk about the philosophy here as well. But you are framing consciousness as sort of this binary yes or no condition. And I'm curious if that is just a concession to making the math at all tenable, or if in the case of AI systems, it really feels like the right question to be asking. You might think in the biological realm, people would assume some sort of continuum from an embryo to a fully formed human being that is, not having some light switch moment. And same as you look across species, but AI systems are being developed in this very different way. So yeah, what's going behind that choice?
The model outputs a number, right? And there are various ways to interpret that number. And so the interpretation we normally give is it's a probability of consciousness. But I don't think you need to interpret it that way. So I think you can also interpret it as this is a level of consciousness within a spectrum. And we don't have a really firm view. So for consciousness specifically, I think the team doesn't have a really firm view of whether we should think it's a binary quality or a quality that comes in degrees. But a lot of the features that we have to model in the process of modeling consciousness are going to be things that do pretty, uncontroversially come in degrees. And so we need to include the degrees in the model as well. And we think that the basic Bayesian approach, if you just interpret them as probabilities of having this feature to the degree that you would need to in order to be conscious, will provide kind of a philosophical foundation. But we're not super committed to reading them explicitly as probabilities in every case. And we would invite thinking about them as degrees as well, if that's how you're inclined.
Nice. All right. If we can dive a bit more into the philosophical side of things here, and maybe feel free to interpret this as more of a reflection on your gathering of what the community thinks. As well, if you don't want to venture your own opinions. But Alex Foster here is wondering how important it seems like embodiment, either physical or virtual, will be in the development of potentially self-aware conscious AI systems.
So I will say that, we started doing some more like systematic background research on various of these features. And embodiment is definitely one of the top candidates for like a feature that might matter. Um, I That's the model perspective. Me personally, I'm actually quite inclined toward the view that embodiment, I mean, to the extent I have any firm beliefs about any of this, is to think that embodiment is incredibly important. But here's one of my caveats, right? So I think if you think like, what's the point of being conscious in an animal life? A lot of it is like organizing a whole bunch of signals and designing one unified motion, right? Like unified agency to move around in the world to represent yourself in space from a, allocentric kind of way. These things are really compelling to me. On the other hand, that's just not the kind of lifestyle that an AI is going to have. And we could go two ways with this. We could say it doesn't need consciousness because it doesn't have the behavioral requirements that animals have. Or you might just say embodiment is a theory of what consciousness is for in animals, and the theory of what it's for in AIs is going to be quite different. So this is just to get to, as soon as I start thinking, yeah, I kind of can get my head around what consciousness is for in animals, let me apply that to AIs, I run into that problem of interpretation to be like, am I applying it and so therefore AIs aren't conscious? Or do I just think to extend the theory to AIs will require some creativity?
Yeah, it's so tricky that we only have this one domain in which we have any reference for how to think about consciousness. And actually, there's an interesting question from Ethan that feels related. He's wondering whether the fact that systems might become conscious is tied to the training data being produced by this conscious species called Homo sapiens. Like, if we look at systems like AlphaFold that are training on a very abstract problem in an abstract space of protein folding, do we think that there's a possibility of consciousness developing there, or is it specifically this training objective of imitating the outputs of us humans that makes us think consciousness is likely in some of these systems?
I think it's a lot harder to recognize signs of consciousness in a system that is not at all human-like. It doesn't mean that it can't exist, but I think it would require much closer attention to the architecture, to the internals of what that system is like. One advantage you have if you're trying to build a conscious system, training on human data, is at least you are encouraging it to have a kind of structure of mind similar to us. It's got to be able to think about the world in some vague sense. It's got to be able to approach the world in something like the way that we do. And that might make it easier for it to be conscious if it replicates the way that we approach the world. But it also makes it easier for us to kind of see ourselves in the model. So I mean, I don't necessarily think that perception is going to be accurate. We may be much more inclined to misattribute consciousness to systems that are more human-like and that have been trained on human data. So it's complex. I think there's a lot of considerations both ways, and there's not a straightforward answer for it.
Yeah. I guess that brings us back to this sort of fundamental uncertainty that's lurking in every corner of this topic. And we have an interesting question here from Arvo, who's sort of asking about some potential downsides here. Is there any worry that people might misinterpret or misuse outputs from this model? There's always this risk when you attempt to quantify something that you're giving a false sense of certainty, even if you are quantifying that mathematically. Is it the appropriate time to be trying to pinpoint this with numbers and probabilities?
Yeah, it's a problem because stating a number threatens to anchor people on that number, and so you better be sure that you have it right.
Yeah.
So I think part of the rollout of this and discussion of this is going to be, we have to be at pains to say what this model shows and what this model doesn't, and how many uncertainties are present in it. So, to be very eager to say, this is tracking sort of like what the implications of certain inputs are. And here's how much uncertainty exists in the model and things like this. Because you're right, there's a worry that you run the risk of giving a number that's way too low, and then people anchor on that and go with it. or too high, and people anchor and go with it. So I think, again, community sort of buy-in to this model, so an understanding of what the number reflects and how many uncertainties there are will be really important.
All right, so we've got a few minutes left. Feel free to trigger out if you've got a 4:30, or I should say, sorry, 5:30 meeting to get to. But knowing this is an ongoing project, I wonder if we could look ahead for a second to when you guys have a full report, and how you envision this sort of affecting decision makers and policymakers. Can you say a bit about how this might affect AI safety as a cause area, and just how in general you expect this model to be useful out in the real world?
One of the key values I see for this project is just being very explicit about what the different considerations are and what the actual indicators of uh, uh, the features that we think are most important are and how they fit into this model. So we would like to see proposals we have for indicators that we think are easy enough to research and would make a big difference to at least some of the stances on how probable they think consciousness is in these systems. We'd like to see people run with these experiments and conduct them and update our understanding of these models. Would also like to see people who disagree with the approach or think we missed a stance or misinterpreted a stance. So I think one of the values of making the stuff concrete is that it gives a forum or a concrete target for people to discuss. So we'd like to see a lot more discussion of these things. We'd like to see further research. I think it's unclear exactly how we think this will affect policy in the near term. It's hard to predict what the major policy decisions will be like in a year, but we think this can, say, guide research in important avenues for actually assessing AI moral status.
Well, I wanted to answer this question partially as a way of answering your previous question. So one thing, like why do this now and why try to get this framework out ahead of time? Well, one thing that I think is important is to say we can track how our probabilities change over time. So like why get in early? Well, partially is we have a baseline. And if you communicate, you don't need to take the output seriously, but you need to take the relationship between outputs over time seriously. That might be something that will keep people from anchoring on a specific value. But if that value has increased 100 times over, probabilities increase that much over a short period of time, then that would be worthwhile even more than the absolute number that comes out. And the other thing is that, there are many ways you could run one of these models. One is with the community judgments put in, or what we think the best, scientific reflection on the model is, or individual. A hope is that individual users can be like, what do I think? And given what I think, here's what I think my probability should be. And that kind of usage could be useful to particular policymakers or labs that have idiosyncratic views and they want to know how those are changing over time. And then the more broad community input calibrated model could say something like, let's start a conversation about sort of set the stage for this issue and what depends on it and how this is changing over time. We hope that will be a little bit of it can help in movement building to have this kind of, broad unifying kind of perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we'll look forward to seeing those outputs and how they affect the discourse and the broader efforts here. But I think we'll call it there for now. Again, there will be office hours right after this upstairs if you'd like to ask some questions directly from Hayley and Derek. But for now, please join me in thanking them one more time.